It's an unfortunate reality, but injuries play a big part in fantasy football, so we need to understand how they affect players, the players that are coming into the season with injuries and all that good stuff. In today's video, I broke down a conversation with Dr. Edwin Porras of Fantasy Points, and we went through all of the major injuries at quarterback, at running back, at wide receiver, and at tight end. Unfortunately, my microphone was like echoing for no reason, so I'm going to kind of cut in and out of our conversation solo to when I'm speaking and then duo to when he's speaking, just because my microphone was just absolutely unbearable and I didn't want to, get him back on to rehash the same exact conversation. So just bear with me on that. He also had a little bit of lag on his side, but it was a very valuable conversation. I really encourage you to stick around to the end. Only the Kyler Murray part was kind of laggy, so it should be good for the most part, but let's get right into it. So we started with the quarterback position, and no bigger quarterback to talk about than the smallest quarterback in the league with Kyler Murray, who obviously tore his ACL in December. It was a non-contact knee injury. He had surgery on January 3rd. We've heard reports that he's likely to start camp and potentially the regular season on the PUP list. So I wanted to get Edwin's thoughts because I know, on this channel, we talked about Kyler Murray being like one of the biggest buys in all of Dynasty. And even from a redraft perspective, I think people are being a little bit unfair with how long they think he's going to be out. Just because Arizona's a bad team and, maybe they're tanking for Caleb Williams or whatever, people just think that Kyler's going to sit out the entire season. I don't think that's very likely, and Edwin didn't either. And he also brought up some recent examples of some guys that have come back pre-9 months of an ACL tear, which would actually put Kyler Murray on track to start. So we'll roll that conversation, and then we'll get into the next one.
Yeah, no, that you nailed it. His surgery was January 3rd. We know it was an ACL, and there was some meniscus involvement. We either think it was a trim or it was a bigger procedure where they sort of sewed it back together. But the timelines you're correct. Like in terms of a safe return, 9 months is very possible, but we know we've seen crazy outliers lately. We saw Chris Godwin at 8. That didn't turn out so great. We saw Michael Gallup at 7.5, which is even crazier. He also didn't perform the best until the second half of the season, started picking it up a little bit. Now, do they always come back and wait until 9 months? No, they don't. We're seeing that more lately. So as far as Kyler Murray goes, I'm on board with you. Like, I agree. I think fantasy Twitter is treating the situation in Arizona. They're treating it like they treat a lot of these situations like they have in the past. We're sort of acting as if we know what the Cardinals are thinking. We're acting like we know what Kyler is thinking, and we're acting as if there's precedent for any quarterback of Kyler Murray's status ever do this and go through this. Like we have no idea what either camp is thinking. We don't know if Kyler wants to go out there and maybe he knows that he might be trade bait if the Cardinals are going to really truly tank, and he wants to get stuff on film, right? Or maybe he's like a true competitor and cannot see a world where Kyler Murray, especially given the fact that he's won his entire career leading up to the NFL, like literally from the time he was in high school, has been just a winner in all aspects of football. It's hard to imagine him just saying like, even though I'm ready to play, I'm going to sit back. There's so many factors that we just don't know and can't really say for a fact. So I really think that this 9-month mark is going to be somewhere along the lines that we see him. I do think PUP is possible, but I'm not seeing this like going to sit out until week 6, week 7, week 8. Like, I really think within the first 4 to 6 weeks of the season, we're going to see Kyler Murray back. Now, in terms of his rushing production, it's kind of all over the board. His rushing production is, if it mirrors, so let's say it mirrors somebody like Carson Wentz in his first season back. Carson's rushing production, his attempts, I shouldn't say production, his attempts per game went down by 37%, which is bananas. That's a precipitous dip. Or we can, for some reason, Deshaun Watson, when he came back, his went up by 22%. So there's probably going to be some middle ground there in terms of rushing for Kyler. They're probably going to do, fewer designed runs. It's probably going to be, probably going to try to keep him, maybe it depends on the offense. We haven't seen the offense, right? But like maybe bootlegs, maybe keep him in the pocket a little bit more. But in terms of like a re-injury risk, it's relatively low. And I do think that we see Kyler Murray out there for more than half the season. I just think his ADP is bananas right now. It's like 100. Last time I checked, it was like 168 or something like that. I think that's way too low.
So Kyler Murray, definitely a big buy. Definitely go and send some offers out for him. The next quarterback that we talked about was Brock Purdy, who obviously tore his UCL in his elbow in January in the NFC Championship against Philly, and then he began throwing May 29th. So he's already resumed his throwing sessions. According to the 49ers brass, it seems like there's optimism that he'll be ready for week 1. And my understanding, and you guys know me and Danny have gone back and forth on this, is that if Brock Purdy's healthy, he's going to be the clear-cut starter. I don't think they want to start Trey Lance. I think Brock Purdy is their guy, and we talked about that in depth in this part here.
Yeah. So the thing with Brock Purdy is, I think, and I've explained it before, is he didn't have a full Tommy John surgery. It is a Tommy John, quote unquote, Tommy John ligament. He didn't have the full reconstruction. He had a repair. So it's not the same thing that you see in pitchers. So pitchers are going to take anywhere these days, it's a little faster. In theory, with the hybrid approach, is called, you come back between 9 and 12 months. With a repair, they use bone tissue. They don't have to do anything too crazy. They sort of sew you back up and they throw you back out there. You rehab, you get through a throwing program, and it's not as big of a deal as a reconstruction. That's what Purdy had. So he's right on the cusp. A quarterback can come back from these much faster than a pitcher because they throw as hard, they don't throw as often, and it's just overall a lower intent activity. So they're able to go through their throwing program a lot quicker. From a medical perspective, by the time he hits 6-7 months, that is going to be like he's probably going to be, if not totally ready, 100%. He's going to be extremely close. Like, he is cutting it a little close. I think he'll be about 6 1/4 months or something. By the time week 1 rolls around. I think from a medical perspective, a physical perspective, he will be there. I think he's got a legitimate shot. I would be extremely surprised if he isn't starting or playing at least by week 4 of the NFL season. I think that's a long shot. If not, week 1 through 3. So the only thing that could hold him back, I think, is from like a logistical standpoint. If he is still getting through his throwing progression by the time August hits, by the time the middle of July is here, if he's not done with his throwing program by then he's not going to get full-time reps, right? That might be something that they hand over to Trey Lance, or apparently Sam Darnold, who is, thrown his hat in the ring for the starting job, whatever, take that for what it's worth. I had to throw that in there. But anyway, from a physical perspective, I think he's going to be ready. It's just a matter of, is he going to get logistically enough snaps with the first team by the time week 1 rolls around that the Niners will feel comfortable throwing him out there.
From Brock Purdy, we also talked about Trey Lance. I just wanted to get an idea if the injury was a concern. He didn't seem very concerned about, the broken ankle that he suffered in September. It wasn't nearly as bad as like Dak Prescott's broken ankle from a couple of years ago, but he did actually kind of make allusions to that situation.
No, man, that was such a sort of fluke injury. It was like very similar. It wasn't quite the same, but it was similar to Dak Prescott's 2020 injury. It was just really strange that the way that it happened, the way that it went down. You don't see severe injuries like that happen on sort of routine play rolled on. So not to say that that's necessarily routine. You get a 300-pound lineman landing on you at full speed, but you don't see those types of injuries happen very often. So from a physical perspective, though, like, he should be, physically ready to go. There shouldn't be any issues with that. Like, in terms of the rushing, like you're talking about the upside, I know that the season back, specifically Dak's rushing went down, his designed attempts went down. And that's probably the team sort of like protecting him to a certain extent, or at least in their eyes, protecting him from the rushing attempts. So if he does have that upside, if he does play, if he is going to be sort of like you're saying, like, contribute right away, that volume, we might have to sort of temper our expectations with a little bit.
Finally, to close out the quarterback position, I'm moderately concerned about Matthew Stafford. I would say the spinal contusion he had in 2022, he had an elbow injury in 2021 that apparently he was still dealing with, but he is expected to be a full go through the offseason program. And Edwin talked in depth kind of about how Matthew Stafford is an older player and maybe he just up and retires and that kind of thing. That was definitely an interesting conversation, but I'll let him kind of take it away.
Yeah, I mean, if we zoom out a little bit, you don't love any guy who plays football to have gone on the injured reserve list with what amounts to a spinal cord injury, right? That's scary. Like, that's some scary stuff. That's some heavy stuff. He has had the back stuff. That stuff doesn't go away. You mentioned the elbow already. That stuff doesn't necessarily go away. So it's like all these little nagging aches and pains. And you worry with Stafford is, like, even if he doesn't miss time because of injury, you wonder, like, at what point throwing the ball, rotating through his low back, rotating through that elbow, Does he wake up generally sore? Does he have any numbness and tingling that go into his feet because of that spinal cord issue that he had? Like, at what there's got to be a point, and obviously Matthew Stafford is one of the toughest dudes in the league. They're all super tough, but we've seen Matthew Stafford play through some pretty crazy stuff. You have to wonder at, mid 30s, right? I think he's like 36, 37 at this point. I asked the same question. Like, at what point does a guy wake up in the, Monday morning and just say, God, this shit is just not worth it anymore? Like, when does that happen? And even if it's not in a big macro dose, like, I'm not saying he's going to, wake up and retire one day in the middle before week 10 or something. But I do wonder, like, how much does that weigh on guys when they do get into week 11, when they do get into week 12, 13, 14, how much of those micro doses of just like, this is tough, actually plays into their, like, there's no way to quantify that, but there's also the risk, like, that's a little bit more tangible, is like, you have a spinal cord contusion, like, the biggest predictor for future injuries, previous injury at the same site. So, I mean, there's some sort of vulnerability there with the spinal cord stuff, with the back stuff, with the elbow stuff. So that re-injury stuff is a lot more tangible. So he can still be good. He can still put up probably some numbers. I mean, he's throwing to Cooper Kupp. All he's got to do is underhand toss to Cooper Kupp and he'll make something happen, right? Like, at some point, I understand that comes into play. I don't know what his ADP is, but
it's late. It's like quarterback 27 off the board.
Oh, wow. I think that might be a little excessive. So I probably would be fine with taking him at that point. But also, I don't think he shouldn't be. Let me put it this way. For me, I'm not, if I somehow end up in a position where I have to take value at receiver and running back, and then all of a sudden I look up and I'm like, oh shit, I didn't get any of the top 12, 13, 14 quarterbacks, I'm not going to click Matthew Stafford. But if I'm in a 2 QB league and he's my third, maybe depending on situation, my second quarterback, I'm fine with that. But I wouldn't go in, and I don't think most people do, into any 2 QB league with just Stafford as your second quarterback.
Then we got into the running backs, and Javonte Williams and Breece Hall were the big two that we talked about for the most part. But I will say, like, the running back position, there wasn't a ton of major injuries coming off. If I didn't ask him about, like, Jonathan Taylor or any of these guys, I asked him about it before we started recording, and he said these two were the only guys that he was really overly concerned with. So Javonte Williams, for those of you guys that don't know, he suffered a multi-ligament ACL tear. So ACL, LCL, and PCL all torn on contact, so an on-contact injury, not a non-contact injury, suffered on October 2nd, which was, I believe, week 4 or 5 of the NFL season. He had surgery about a week later. The recovery timetable, in my understanding, was close to 12 to 15 months, or at least closer to the 12 months of the 9 to 12 month ACL recovery schedule that we hear for regular ACL tears. As we saw from J.K. Dobbins, it is encouraging to see Dobbins, close out the season strong, but of course he needed a procedure to clean up his knee. He wasn't really, 100% until like week 14 of the season. So Javonte Williams was a guy that he was not optimistic on, nor am I.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a lot of good points. Like, in terms of Javonte Williams, he did have a more severe injury. If he's back by the 9-month mark, I'll be extremely surprised. If he's back by 10 months, I will still be surprised. I think if we start hearing rumblings around month 11, month 12, I think that makes a lot more sense for his specific injury. It does just take more time for those guys to make a bounce back. It's just going to take time, and that's the bottom line. And I actually think a better comparison for Javonte is actually Gus Edwards, because Javonte doesn't profile athletically close to J.K. Dobbins. He actually more closely resembles, and again, it's not apples to apples here, but he actually profiles a little more closely to Gus Edwards, who also had a pretty severe ACL injury last year. I'm relatively certain Gus Edwards had the same injury that Javonte had, and I think we had Gus back in, you're gonna have to jog my memory, I think it was just right around a year from the time that he had surgery that Gus Edwards came back. That's real. That's like a realistic timeline for Javonte Williams. I know we've seen him running in practice. I know that he's been doing straight line running. I know that he was carrying the football, and that was encouraging. That's probably right around where he should be. That was around the time he was 7 or 8 months, and he was jogging, going pretty slow. That seems normal to me. So here is like the issue with Javonte Williams is he's a good running back. I'm not arguing that he's a bad running back by any means. The thing with Javonte Williams is, like, we look at all of the outlier factors and the outlier characteristics in running backs that are going to smash in their first year back. Breece checks all of those. like really good speed score, super like athletic freak, even by NFL standards, super high draft capital, super young, really good opportunity. And the organization isn't going to give up on him. So obviously Javonte checks some of those boxes, but athletically, he's not even close. From a sport perspective, Breece is in the 92nd percentile, raw athleticism, and Javonte's in like the 69th percentile. And Javonte's speed score is also like super low. Like he's got an even lower speed score and 40-yard dash than Gus Edwards. And we know that that's another like marker of success. The obvious one we already talked about at the top was like the complexity of the injury is just more than Breece's. So you could be rolling with Javonte. Let's say he really gets back on his feet week 9, 10, 8, 9, 10. He could have a setback like J.K. Dobbins. He could have an injury to his hamstring like Gus Edwards. Like there just is so much more variance in those guys. And especially if he starts on PUP. I know I'm going on and on. Like the last thing I'll say is like guys who have started on PUP since 2010, running backs who have started on PUP since 2010, there have been 14 of them. Or I'm sorry, let me back up and say that correctly. 14 guys have missed time due to lower body injuries in the following season after ACL. 7 of those 14 started on PUP. So just the beginning, the complexity of that injury like precludes them sometimes, 50% of the time in this case, to lower body injuries moving forward. So he could be rolling. Like I said, you could be feeling pretty feeling yourself about your best ball teams in week 12, 13, 14. Playoffs come, boom, potential setback. Maybe he needs a cleanup like J.K. Dobbins had, or he has a hamstring like Gus had. So there's just a lot more variance is what I'm trying to say. And there's the percentage of pre-injury production for these guys that come off the PUP is 52% from a fantasy points perspective on a points per game basis. So things are just not historically looking great for Javonte.
Breece Hall was a little bit more interesting because Breece Hall did not have the multi-ligament ACL tear that Javonte Williams had. He had just an ACL and meniscus tear on October 22nd, less complex than Javonte's from like a surgical perspective, and he is supposedly on track to start in week 1, receiving positive buzz from Robert Saleh. I'm still concerned at his ADP at 30.8 on Underdog. He's still like a mid-third rounder. Edwin was not concerned. So this was probably the biggest takeaway of this entire video. And you guys are going to hear kind of how he talks about Breece Hall and kind of like the peripherals that stack up in Breece Hall's favor to say that, hey, maybe he could be an outlier. Because I think a lot of the times we think it's black and white, right? Never draft a running back off an ACL tear. You want them in their second year kind of thing. But to Edwin's point, like we have seen players perform at a high level off of ACL tears, including, Adrian Peterson and Jamal Charles. And, Saquon Barkley was probably on track to do so had he not broken his ankle or sprained his ankle in week 5 of 2021. So he had a lot to say about Breece Hall. And this was definitely a really, really interesting conversation. It really opened my eyes to him.
Oh, dude, 3rd round, absolutely. I said the other day on Justin Boone's pod on the Score Pod, I'd take him top 12 to 15 if I really had to. Obviously, I don't have to, but like all the risk associated with running backs and injury, like to me, it's negligible for a guy that has that much upside. I mean, we're talking legitimate top 5 upside for a guy like Breece Hall. And I think another thing that really irks me, like you kind of mentioned the narrative aspect of this, what irks me about like any guy coming back from injury is that fantasy managers will do this thing where they're like, oh, well, he's not going to be 100%. And I think there's like that loss, like lost in translation. Your NFL numbers as a pure running back or a pure receiver, whatever you are, can be down a little bit without your fantasy production taking a 1-to-1 hit. So like I would take a 90% Breece Hall. I'll take a 95% Breece Hall, right? Knowing that probably by the time like week 10, 11, 12 rolls around, he's going to be pretty close to 100%. Even if you weren't drafting him at 100%, he's going to get there. And his 90% is better than like most other running backs, after the top 12, after the top 10 even. Like though his 90% is better than those guys' 100%. His 80% is probably better than those guys' 100%. So like I'm drafting Breece Hall. The only concern, and because I've challenged myself to try to like talk myself through maybe some negative scenarios, is it could, in theory, lead to something similar to what Dalvin Cook had. Like Dalvin Cook came back, after his rookie season having torn his ACL. He ended up missing 5 games because of a hamstring strain. Call it workloads, call it compensation, whatever the case may be. There's some risk there for that because of the massive change in workloads, because he's basically going right college, NFL, gets accustomed to NFL workload. Oh, wow, tore my ACL. rehabbed at the pro level, getting back to pro, to pro level of play at that point. Like those fluctuations in his workload could lead to something down the road potentially, right? But again, that's really hard to quantify, but that is some sort of risk that you take on. And again, what the average missed time for running backs from hamstring strain, I'm just going through this right now, getting ready to pump my ebook out. Like those guys miss like 1.4 games or something like that. So if I get 1.4 games or, 15 and a half games from Breece Hall this year, like I'll be happy with that. So that's sort of the way that I've weighed his risk. I will say the last thing I'll say is you mentioned two guys, J.K. Dobbins and Saquon. So I think I was on here last year when I like got on my soapbox. I was like, Saquon's ankle injury was a fluke. And the dude was on pace after only playing 48% of snaps in week 1, was on pace through week 4 to be like the RB9 or something like that. And then he had the fluke ankle injury. Like those flukes happen. Like there are guys who get injured again the following year, but like those types of flukes happen. And then the other guy, like J.K. Dobbins, again, there are always so many. It's like you're saying, like it's very nuanced. It's not always black and white. Like J.K. Dobbins, given everything that he went through last year, the dude still was at 91% of his pre-injury fantasy level. Now, obviously, it's easier to get to 90% of, 10 and a half points or whatever it was than it is to get to 90% of 16, 17 points, 18 points. But like, nonetheless, like he had a cleanup procedure, he had a recurrence, he was on the pup, like all that stuff. And he still was able to manage that 90% of previous injury. So like, it's all relative. But like the more athletic they are and the more boxes that they check, the closer they have, the closer their potential, if that makes sense, to get to their ceiling. And yeah, you said it, like Breece Hall checks literally every single box.
So we spent most of the time talking about the running back position. We did go in depth on some of the wide receivers as well, particularly Cooper Kupp and Michael Thomas, because Cooper Kupp had a high ankle sprain that needed surgery in week 10. And for me, I thought it was kind of, invoking some, scared trepidation about what happened with Michael Thomas. Because if you guys recall, a couple of years ago, Michael Thomas suffered an ankle injury in week 1 against the Buccaneers, and he kind of has never been the same after that. That was the first game pretty much after his massive breakout record-setting season, and he kind of just, fell off a cliff after that, dealt with injuries in 2020, dealt with more injuries in 2021. In 2022, he barely played at all. Like, this guy, dealt with a ton of injuries, and Cooper Kupp is a guy that is, getting up there in age, obviously just came off of a massive season. His quarterback is dealing with injuries, so I was really concerned about him. And then from Michael Thomas's perspective himself, even though he was good in the limited time he played last year, he dislocated his toe. He's had ankle injuries in previous years. There's the no such thing as injury-prone narrative that, Edwin very much is a believer in. But I wanted to know if he thinks, Michael Thomas is injury-prone.
No, I don't want to say I'm not concerned, but I'm not concerned. The Michael Thomas thing is it's been really strange from the beginning. I don't think there are a lot of great comparisons for what's happened with that guy. I mean, he had the ankle, and then he had the other ankle, and then he had the ankle again, and then he had the toe. Like, this is kind of strange. Whereas Kupp actually had an ankle injury. He was on the report with an ankle injury prior to the one that actually took him out. So he was already dealing with something. A lot of these guys are dealing with something anytime that catastrophe strikes. He obviously is not a spring chicken anymore, but he's not necessarily older. But we did see in that first week back for Michael Thomas, like he was moving well. He was looking good. He was able to score some fantasy points, and then he went down with the second injury. As far as Cooper Kupp goes, like, again, there is some risk that goes with drafting a guy after these injuries. But I have a list, and I pulled it up right here because I actually was curious when I saw the Cooper Kupp thing. And when it comes to like season-ending injury and then guys coming back, I don't really have any comparison since 2016. I looked at high ankles since 2016, and there aren't very many guys who missed a ton of games, were in their prime, essentially, the way that Cooper Kupp is, and then underperformed the following season. I just think that there's precedent that once he gets the tightrope, once he fixes it up, like he's going to be fine. But again, if you're splitting hairs and you're thinking about what we talked about earlier with Matthew Stafford, and he is on the downturn, right? What are the Rams going to do like from an offensive perspective? Like all that stuff. Like I get it. He comes with some risk. I probably wouldn't take him like 1 overall necessarily, but I wouldn't overcorrect for this high ankle sprain because it wasn't like the fact that they did a tightrope means that it was a relatively benign surgical issue. And they were able to clean it up with the tightrope. So I'm not extremely concerned.
Finally, we close out the wide receiver position talking about Amari Cooper, and I talked about Amari Cooper in Friday's video, talking about 3 players that I don't know how to rank. And for me, Amari Cooper is just one of these guys that, he doesn't miss a ton of time with injuries, but he's always playing through something, it seems like. And, it affects his game. And sometimes when he's healthy, he's able to be like a top, 20, top 15 wide receiver. But then when he's playing through something, he's a lot more inefficient. He misses more, practice time and that kind of thing. So he did have core muscle surgery this offseason, which is why I wanted to bring this up with Edwin, because we know he's dealt with, plantar fasciitis and a number of other injuries as well. And I kind of joked that like Amari Cooper is the type of guy that, will always play through injuries and you have no idea if he's healthy or not. And then at the end of the season, you find out that he was playing through something and that's why he had a bad season. And he gets all of our hopes up the second we think he's going to be great. He ends up being, not that good. So me and Edwin had a pretty good laugh about that, but this is what he had to say about him.
Yeah, I mean, dude, Amari Cooper's been in the league. Like, I feel like he was in the league before I was born. Like, he's been in the league forever. He came in so young. So he has had a lot of injuries. This core muscle situation specifically, there's actually good data on NFL players specifically. They come back. They don't necessarily miss any extra time the following season. It's a really good procedure. It performs really well. And guys are able to hit their previous season's numbers. So even though there's a little bit of like, maybe it tightens up on him during the season, it's not going to be anywhere near the extent that it was the season before. So if you are staring down the barrel of who can I pick for my, wide receiver 3 and somehow Amari Cooper's still on the board, I don't know what his ADP is. I haven't looked at ADP lately.
Think about the mid-third round right now.
Mid-third round. Man, I don't know. If you're going, let's say you go, I don't know. Somehow you go because Breece is in the third round too. That's a little high. I guess that's a little high. I feel that's a little high even with like before the injury though, right? Like let's take the injury out of it. Third round for Amari Cooper seems a little.
That's what I'm talking about, man. Like
right?
It seems like Amari Cooper's doing that thing again where he gets all of us to buy back in. And I did this with the Cowboys. Like when he first got to Dallas, I was like, oh man, this guy looks awesome. And then whatever it was 2 years ago when Dak was coming back from the ankle injury, I was like all in on Amari Cooper. And to his credit, he doesn't ever really miss games. He just plays through stuff and is terrible. That's usually what happens with Amari Cooper. So for me, I'm like core muscle surgery. We're set up for a prototype 11.0 points per game Amari Cooper season where he plays 15 games, but at the end of the season, he's like, I wasn't healthy the entire year.
Now, I think he'll be healthy. I don't love that ADP regardless. I'll put it that way. That's really all I have to say, I think.
And then Darren Waller. Darren Waller dealt with ankle and knee injuries the past couple of years, hamstring strains that kept him out for a number of games as well the last 2 seasons. I was curious, like, is he injury prone? Is he the type of guy that we don't want to invest in now that he's over 30 and he's been dealing with all these injuries? Edwin said it's kind of just like a relatively at cost thing. So I'll roll his thoughts on that one, then we'll close this video out.
I think that like the biggest concern you have is he's over 30 with it was a hamstring, right? Last year, not groin. It was a hamstring that kept him out like 100 games. That you don't love that. I've been really racking my brain and it must not have happened very recently. I'm trying to think of a guy because this also applies to Keenan Allen who missed like 5+ games because of a hamstring injury and then was just fine the next year. I can't find it. He's a tight end, so I guess you got to take your darts. And worst case scenario, right? You take him in the what's he going like the 4th or 5th? I don't know. You lose.
He's going later than that. He's coming at a bigger discount than that. At least he's the tight end 8 or 9 off the board, so you don't have to draft him until the 7th round or something, 8th round.
Honestly, like I would probably be fine with that 7th or 8th round because. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? He goes down again with another hamstring or groin issue, and then you're just streaming like the rest of your league mates, but you filled your flex at that point. Like, I think that's actually fine. Just know that when you're drafting him, like there is risk involved with a soft tissue injury coming off like missing, 5+ games.
Yeah, I think I'm just scarred by all these old players. They have these like injury blurbs or like stretches of down play, and then you talk yourself back into them. Like, I was so high on Julio Jones when he went to Tennessee, and obviously he was like a washed-up player at that point in time. Allen Robinson fucking screwed me last year with the Rams, and same with Thomas has screwed me in years past as well. I was really high on Michael Thomas last year, and obviously he looked good when he was on the field, but he wasn't on the field for more than like 3 games. So for me, I'm just like I might just start like applying the rules that I apply to running back, which is don't draft any old ones, to wide receivers that are like 29 or older that are dealing with, injuries and stuff. I'm like, I'm just going to draft a bunch of young players in fantasy this year. So,
all right, if you guys made it all the way to the end, leave a like, comment down below over your thoughts. Again, I'm sorry we had to go back and forth between like me going solo and then Edwin obviously talking because my microphone was completely inaudible in the recorded version that we did. But hopefully you still got some value from this. Like I said, if you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new around here. Make sure to check out our site, flockfantasy.com/FSE, for dynasty rankings, for articles, for my top 10 positional rankings for 2024 fantasy football rookie drafts as well, because those are, you want to get ahead of your league mates. You want to find out how good the running back class is next year, how good the wide receiver class is next year. All that stuff should be live right now, so definitely check that out. And if you want to take some of the advice that we talked about into action today, Breece Hall being a perfect example, who's going in the mid-third round of underdog drafts, go on over to Underdog Fantasy, hit the sign up button if you guys haven't already done so, and use promo code FSE when you sign up for 100% back on first deposit up to $100. You can enter a bunch of Best Ball Mania drafts. They have, smaller contests going on right now, like the Dalmatian, Pomeranian, or whatever they're called. So definitely check those out if you're interested. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.